Hello, welcome to the Strategies Practice vlog. Today we have Richard Whittington from Saïd Business School, Oxford University as our guest. My name is Renate Kratochvil from Stockholm School of Economics, and I'm very honored to interview Richard on celebrating a quarter century of strategy as practice, reflecting back and looking forward. This is in the context of this year's Happy Birthday to Strategy as Practice. Welcome, Richard, and thank you for taking the time. I would ask you to start reflecting on the journey of strategy as practice, as you've been the founder and a central figure in our community and research stream.
Thank you, Renata, and happy birthday to all SAP researchers. As Renata said, would like to think back at about a quarter of a century of SAP work. Actually, one could go back even further, and I will honor some of the forebears in this area as well. But at the same time, I want to look forward because one of my key messages, I think, today is there is a rich, ever self-regenerating agenda for strategy as practice research. So this is an exciting time for SAP researchers, not just a birthday celebration. And my slide here, my opening slide here, I hope you can see it, um, references some of the themes I want to talk about today. In the first place, we see the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. We have some prehistory to strategy as practice. You see an EasyJet fin, and we'll find also that EasyJet played a role in the evolution of the SAP field in a way that, in some ways, was necessary, but also we should regret because I think there's some missteps early in our development. The third one is a tin of paint. And on that tin, there's the word practices. And I want to insist that SAP is about practices as much as anything else, if not more. There's a Magritte painting, the famous one of the pipe. But here what we're saying is this is not a pipe, but this is what is not a practice. That's where some of our missteps may have occurred. But finally, I want to end on a flower, a blooming flower, a hardy perennial, the sense that SAP has lots of new ideas and will always be self-regenerating. It's always springtime in SAP. Okay, I shall move to the next slide then and explain what I want to do. We're reflecting back a little bit to think about the pathway SAP research has gone on since, well, the late 1980s. A little bit on impact, how much impact we've managed to make, not just in the strategy field, but also in adjacent fields such as accounting and marketing. Something on what might even explain the success of the practice turn in strategy and elsewhere, marketing, leadership, accounting, and so on and so forth, i.e. the drivers. Some of the things we've learnt on the path, especially what I've learnt. And I think I made some mistakes early on. To some extent, those mistakes might be shared by others. Perhaps some of them were obvious things we should not have done in the first place. Turning to the more positive, there are some fabulous opportunities for further research in SAP. And I will be arguing that, in fact, that will always be the case. Strategy as practice is a field which is auto-regenerating. It will always be renewing itself as the world changes, new practices and new research methods emerge. Renata's going to guide us a little bit through
Yes,
this six pieces, and Renata, jump in.
thank you for introducing us and also using EasyJet and the flower and the pipe as examples to illustrate to us the journey of strategy as practice. So, yes, let's start with the path, and it's going to be exciting to hear what your mistakes were too.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Renata. This is the path. It's a long and winding path. And sometimes some of the turns were slightly wrong, but of course we learned as we went along. So I'm going to start with the Glenn Morgan and Dave Knight's paper at EGOS in Berlin. Two sets of momentous events happened in Berlin in 1989. EGOS met. There were about 80 people at EGOS in those days. That was the total EGOS membership. And also the Berlin Wall fell. I'm going to concentrate on the less momentous one, but still important for our field. Glenn Morgan and Dave Knights introduced Foucault into the strategy field. And by introducing Foucault, they began to reflect on strategy not as the strategy is diversification strategy or international strategy, something a firm has, but they began to think of it as a social phenomenon. And what they're interested in was the rise of strategy as a social phenomenon, which in a sense, Foucault, in a Foucauldian way, disciplined managers. For me, at that very small conference, this was an electrifying moment, partly because there was a very, very fierce debate between Dave Knights and Andrew Pettigrew. I was a young scholar, and seeing these two great figures do battle over quite radical ideas was extremely exciting, and was a big motivator for me. What you see is, as time went on, a series of papers, conference papers, journal article papers, increasingly in the book, in the blue books, and very importantly also in the purple special issues. And that's been important as we go along. I'm going to draw out from this complicated pathway a few themes. First, the great thing about SAP is it's been really well organized. There have been generations of young scholars who've rallied around the flag, done lots of great work. Renate, I would include you in organizing a great deal of things, conferences, but especially special issues and books, typically book collections. So I'm going to perhaps single out the Golsorki, Rouleau, Seidel, Vara 2010 SAP Handbook, which is now in 3 editions. I'll also mention the Grossman Hansel et al. Encyclopedia in 2025, which I think, Renate, you might be able to correct me on this, has more than 100 contributors on,
Yeah,
far
we
more than 100. Go on,
yeah,
tell us.
the encyclopedia is soon coming out, hopefully still in 2025, with 168 entries from in total 300 or more authors from all over the world. So this is going to be exciting. And all the entries include ideas for future research. So not only what has been done, but also really digging out what and like explaining and showing and providing inspiration about what could be done and how can strategy as practice be studied in the future.
So, Renata, you are a leading figure in producing that volume. It's going to be an ongoing inspiration to researchers in the field, but it also exemplifies the way in which people have worked together collaboratively to create collective outputs, whether it might be handbooks, or it might be encyclopedia, or it might be special issues. So that's one thing. We've always been pluralistic. The critical management studies community has always had an interest, sometimes quite a fun, pugilistic interest in strategy as practice, but it's enlivened the debate. It's great to have both critical management scholars and more pragmatic scholars, perhaps managerial scholars, combined in the community. And we've also, particularly recently, since perhaps the Bergelmann et al. SMJ special issue of 2017, reached out to the process scholars, particularly people like Harry Sukas and Anne Langley. So we've had strategy as practice and process from the Bergelmann et al. Volume elite or special issue at least. We've been gradual, yes,
I just
Renate?
wanted to say how interesting it is to see and hear about this winding road.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, like, when you said that you've been at these egos in Berlin, which had like two very important events, that there were only 80 people, which now is a very big conference. And I was thinking how lucky we are that in Crete, where we had the organization study summer workshop on the future of strategizing and organizing as practice, we were 150 people already. So this is a great success for the community and the research stream you have been building.
Fabulous. And the workshop was nearly twice as big as the whole EGOS conference was. Um, some 30 years ago, practically, or something like that. More than 30 years ago. We've been gradual, so there have been bends in this path. And I'm going to come back to the ing thing, the strategizing and organizing um, terminology, which I think has sometimes slowed us down. And I think the critical management scholars have been right to critique us on that. And I shall explore some of the implications of that. We've always been broad, so we have been interested in strategy and organizing as practice as well. And I'll highlight the Paula Jarzakowski and Renate's special issue in Organization Studies, which is on SOAP, Strategy Organizing as Practice. So we have been eclectic in including others, and I've already mentioned marketing as practice, entrepreneurship as practice, accounting as practice. We have been, let's make a strength of what was initially a weakness, somewhat centripetal. In other words, some of our greatest scholars, the most active SAP communities, have been from outside the United States. In Canada, Australia, and Europe, particularly, but increasingly in Latin America, in Africa, and India, and elsewhere. So we're gradually closing in on the US market, and that must be one of our key targets. And I'm going to refer to our increasing success in the Strategic Management Journal as a token of how we're centripetal, increasingly getting involved in the US. So that's the path, Renata.
It's very interesting to see how it evolved. Thank you. And can you tell us now that you've talked about what was helpful, what might also a bit impede? Tell us more about the impact of strategy as practice.
Happy to. I've already referred to some of these issues. What you see is an increasing references to strategy as practice on Google Scholar. These will be just looking at the references to the phrase strategy as practice. Nowadays, around 1,000 per year. There's sometimes a lag with the Google Scholar statistics, so we don't quite know where it's going, but a comfortable 1,000 a year would be my expectation. And increasingly, publications in what would once have been regarded as leading American journals, and now, of course, are much more pluralistic uh, in many particular domains, but particularly with strategy as practice. We have 17 papers since 2018 in the Strategic Management Journal, 7 in Organization Science, and 6 in the Academy of Management Journal. People like David Seidel, Paula Jarzakowski, and Erivara have been particularly prolific in these journals, Eric Knight as well. So there's been some wonderful, Sotiris Peroutis will be another one. It becomes invidious to single people out. One thing I will mention, SMJ is keen to have submissions in strategy as practice area, and they've been publishing a lot recently. And I'm currently, and I will be for the next 3 years, standing guest editor at the Strategic Management Journal, and likely, at least where there's no conflict, to handle many strategy as practice submissions. So SMJ is deliberately opening the door there. You'll see also, yeah,
And you're
so.
also the president-elect of the Strategic Management Society, which is a great honor for us as strategy as practice scholars, that you're the head and face of the Strategic Management Society
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, so we're looking almost respectable now. Only almost. But anyway, and thank you for mentioning that. I think it does symbolize that SMS as well as the SMJ are increasingly open to SAP type work. Um, and I'm also on the executive committee of the Academy of Management STR division. Uh, the SAP is SAP is also, as you can see, quite widely influential, and the same label as practices have been adopted for some time in accounting, leadership, marketing, information systems, entrepreneurship, and other disciplines within the management studies. So we've made an impact.
That's really great to know, and thank you for being so detailed about how SAP is creating an impact. Can you tell us more about the drivers behind SAP?
Yep, thank you. I've divided them into three. Intellectual. I think the first is, and Shatsky's collective volume way back in 2001 on the practice turning contemporary theory has been important in this. There's been within the social sciences and particularly within sociology, there's been a strong practice theoretic turn. This is exemplified by the influence of not just Foucault, but one of my favorite theorists, Giddens, Bourdieu, Desserteau, and Theodore Shatsky himself. So there's been a widespread practice turn in the social sciences. In that sense, strategy is hitching itself to the same wagon. And you can see that how that has been reflected within organization theory as well, more generally. And so you see, I think, really people like Davide Niccolini were pioneering the communities of practice work on learning, management learning, and learning of skills in organizations. Anne Langley and Harry Sukas developed a strong process view about 15 years ago. Institutional entrepreneurship has become an important theme in organization theory. All of these have a practice stroke process element to them. And even in the strategy discipline too, there's been what we could call a micro turn. Teppo Felin, my old colleague at Saïd Business School, and Nikolai Voss have pioneered the micro foundations movement, about which I have some misgivings, but it's very, very important. The attention-based view is a more micro, if you like, approach. And my old colleague Thomas Powell was involved very much in the behavioral strategy stream of work, which is influential in the Strategic Management Society and elsewhere. So there's been an intellectual driver. So strategy as practice is by no means unique. It's supported by many other things which are happening in the social sciences and in management and organizational theory more generally. There's also, if I can make this work, a cultural change. I mean, first I will actually start with a managerial change. I think managers have changed enormously. When I started doing research, at least in the UK, which is not always the best educated country, many managers, especially senior managers of a particular generation, had never been to university. Now they've all been to university, just
Mhm.
about.
And that
And
also
then go on.
that also affects the data we collect, I guess, and how we.
Well, that's an interesting question because sometimes in interviews, and that's something we might come back to, they throw back at you what they think you want to hear
Mm.
because they become too reflective, and interviews are therefore more challenging. But they're much more open and trusting of business school academics because they've been there. They understand us. They come to us for executive education, so that they are more open to researchers. And they also participate to a certain extent in cultural changes more generally, and that, with the rise of social media and so on and so forth, people are much more frank, much more willing to engage, much more willing to show themselves. Perhaps too much, but at least to researchers, that's a benefit. There's also been a university change. I'm going to exemplify the Advanced Institute of Management in the United Kingdom, which was very important for people like Paula Jazakowski and Julia Balogun and Jerry Johnson, important figures in SAP, because they were given extensive research funding and time off for research. And much of their work has been foundational for SAP, especially its second generation of empirical work. That's important. And I think that change, the Advanced Institute of Management, was an investment by the UK government into management research, which in different ways has been reflected across the world. So there's been much more emphasis on research in recent years. The FT rankings, for instance, of business schools give an important weight to research. So many national governments, but also institutional pressures such as the FT50 rankings have led to greater investment in research, particularly in Europe. And Europe has been generally, typically much more interested in sociological approaches and qualitative research, which have favored SAP as well. My final one is political. We adopted the as practice tag, strategy as practice tag, way back in 1996. I used that as the title of an article in Long Range Planning. Um, this had sufficient ambiguity to be helpful, especially in the early years. So in the SMS, the Strategic Management Society said, "Oh, yeah, we like practice. We want more practitioners. Yes, we'll encourage you." What they didn't thoroughly understand, and frankly, some of them still don't, is as practice as a theoretical label as much as anything else. It was also an easy tag for accounting, leadership, marketing to add as well. So it had great meme or mimetic type qualities, and also its ambiguity was helpful. Sometimes our critics have said we're only being practical. They misunderstand us, but it has opened the door to criticism.
And
We've
have you,
been,
sorry, but
go on.
have you experienced great disappointments also with the ambiguity and then scholars coming for the wrong reasons?
Yeah, quite recently I was at a high level meeting in the SMS where one of the members of the committee said, "Yes, we must feature more research, these interest groups, but we won't need the strategy practice group because they're about practitioners." So those sorts of prejudices have a continuing resonance, and it's something that we can slowly correct. But it takes time. People form views, and we're all like that. We change our views very slowly. We're good at resource capture, frankly. Because we've been organized, we have been able to capture journal special issues, starting from the Journal of Management Studies one through to the forthcoming organization studies one that Renate, that you're involved in. We've done that repeatedly, and we've repeatedly captured things like handbooks and encyclopedias. That's been great. And organizational events like we've managed to, and this comes to movement mobilizing, we've used conferences and workshops extremely well. So EGOS was I think we were the first group to be a standing group at EGOS, Strategy as Practice. I can't remember who gets the credit for it. It wasn't me. Julia Balogun created, the other names were attached, including my own. Effectively, it was she who created the strategizing activities and practices group at the Academy of Management. She was a great politician, and she managed to do that. So we've been very good at mobilizing a social movement and providing spaces where we can meet. I think, Renata, this is fair. We're quite convivial when we meet, and I think we're quite open to new members, and we want more people to join us and take organizing roles, just as you did at an earlier stage in your career and still do. This is really important work, and it builds connections and it builds your profile.
I
Renata, I
can,
don't know
I
whether you want
can,
to.
I can totally relate to that because I think, as most of you know, I don't have my PhD in strategy as practice, but international business. And I basically stumbled in when I first went to AOM as a postdoc in Boston in 2019. And I read about the early career program, and it said strategy as practice. And I thought, oh, there's SDR and there's SAP. The SAP one sounds interesting. Let's go there and see who those people are. And then I stayed around, but everybody was so open and welcoming. And I mean, I just related a lot to how I look at data and theories. So I can only subscribe to what you were saying. And what I also wanted to say, now that you said we're so active in building infrastructure and communities, and that you also see this as a social movement, which it definitely was. For those new to SAP and just hearing about many of those things now, the encyclopedia has a whole section on infrastructure with all the interest groups, the local communities, where everyone can read up on that. and
So
very.
consult the new encyclopedia, of which Renate is one of the editors. Good. Thank
And
you.
you
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is not an advertisement for the encyclopedia, but obviously we know about it. So that's why it comes up.
So
So
the drivers are intellectual, cultural, and political. Let's move on.
yeah, and do you have some learnings from some personal
Yeah.
learnings from this journey?
Yeah, there's a little bit of chagrin. There's a little bit of this is where the EasyJet tail fin comes in. I missed a plane.
Oh.
Yeah. And EasyJet wouldn't let me on to the next plane. It was all a fiasco. But I was going to meet Leif Mellin and Jerry Johnson in Nice, because Leif always likes to go to warm places, and to finalize the introduction to the micro-strategizing strategy and strategizing special issue. Um, so I arrived very, very late, and at that point, I don't think my views were very strong, but I still might have given that introduction a slightly different twist, and then emphasize more practice theory rather than activity as a base. And what I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes is some of my learnings. That strategy as practice is more than what I call the ing thing, strategizing or organizing. It's not really about micro, at least in the ordinary sense. It's not just about micro. And practices is a much better term than activities. And I'm just going to explore those with some embarrassment because I was okay with that introduction. I might have phrased things slightly differently, but basically I was okay. My retrospective reflection is there's some mistakes in there, and it has led to misunderstandings, particularly with some of the critical management scholars I mentioned earlier and elsewhere. Can I just talk about those learnings? The first, activities. Activities are empirical. You can see activities. That's very attractive. But I'm appealing here to a famous advertisement that very few of you will have seen in the United Kingdom, where somebody advertised a wood stain, and the slogan was, "It does exactly what it says on the tin, stains the wood." Strategy as practice is the same. It does exactly what it says on the tin. It's about practices, not activities. Why? Because practices have a much more extensive and enduring character than activities. Activities are what you see in the moment, strategizing. But in fact, those micro moments of activity are expressing much larger things. Your micro strategizing is using tools, discourse, material objects that have a much more extensive and enduring presence. And if we focus on practices, then we have something which is generalizable. If we focus on activities, we limit ourselves. Generalizable, not in the sense of a deductive epistemology, but more in that we have general reach. We can talk about many circumstances, many situations. We can talk about the tools, the discourses, the materiality, the practices, not just the instances of activity. So activity, yes, of course, that's important. But let's always recognize that activity is expressing something bigger, something more enduring. That is practices. So what's on the tin is practices, not activities. That's the kind of thing that I would like to emphasize. Here's another thing that I want to talk about. A bit of an embarrassment. Again, back in 2002, developed a sort of practitioners praxis model, which eventually found its way after a really torrid time at AMR into organization studies in 2006. Um, but the 3P model had implicitly a rather tall ontology. By that I mean Practices are at the top, practitioners are at the bottom, practitioners shaped in a downward way, practitioners bounce back up to affect practices in moments of praxis. I no longer believe that's adequate. So I did a paper earlier this year in strategic organization where I've argued that we need a flatter ontology. A flatter ontology has various advantages, I think. Instead of a hierarchy, as in a tall ontology, where you have practices and practitioners vertically arranged, a flat ontology allows the human and the non-human equal status. So the materiality of PowerPoint slides, of artificial intelligence, of Excel spreadsheets, of the arrangement of the physical arrangements of the sites or rooms in which strategizing activity is carried out, that's now given agency as well, an equal status, or potentially equal status, an influence on what happens in strategizing with a flat ontology. No hierarchy between the human and non-human, a rough equality between the human and the non-human in a flat ontology. So I love the I think it's canon and law distinction or description of a sleeping policeman. A sleeping policeman, that is a block of cement which is or concrete which is put across a road to slow traffic down. It has just as much agency upon the traffic
Mm.
as an alert policeman standing beside the road. The human, the alert policeman, has an effect, but so too does the sleeping policeman, the concrete, which is slowing down the traffic. Okay? It sidesteps individualism. What I have in this 2025 paper is a notion that instead of practitioners being separate from practices, they're immersed in practices. The, the thicker line for practitioners there is meant to convey the sense that they embody practices. In other words, the social is inside the body just as the body is inside the social. It respects continuity. You can see in the jagged, big arrows in the first slide of 2002, a lot of change potentially. The flatter one gives more respect, I think, to continuity. Practices have a stickiness. They're quite hard to change. But finally, above all, the flat ontology doesn't have levels, micro and macro levels. To be fair, the 2002 paper didn't explicitly use that language. It only implied it. But it dissolves the micro into the macro. In other words, what we call a micro strategizing practice is always expressing, is always made possible, is always enacting macro stuff as well. I put micro and macro there in very heavy quotation or scare marks. So that's my second learning. My third is I hope we're doing all right for time, but my third is on the ings, strategizing and organizing and similar. I just fear that they risk what I call a functionalist slide and a dematerializing drift. They are not quite practices, strategizing or organizing or integrating or sense making or linking or segregating, just to take a few fairly random practices or sets of practices which have been discussed in the literature. I'm going to focus on one that I have used myself. That's reinventing and renewing, or reinvention and renewal, in a paper that Anna Plotnikova, Christo Panzer, and I did in strategic organization a year ago. I think we got it slightly wrong. I don't feel this strongly, but I think I just want to warn a little bit. The problem is Shatsky himself will talk about the teleaffective structure of practices, i.e., what you're trying or intending to do, the functions of the practice. So in our paper, Anna Plotnikova's paper, Christo Panzer's and my paper, the practice of renewal or renewing is the restoration of previously used attention channels after a period of interruption. In other words, what we are looking at was practitioners renewing, that is, particularly strategic planners were renewing their attention channels. having had them interrupted. I think there's too much focus here on the purpose, the function, the teleoeffectivity here, and therefore a disregard of the unintended consequences in a Gidensian sense, and also a focus on the effectiveness, what's wanted rather than the material, from a Latourian point of view. I'm just going to touch on this for a moment. So when we look at reinventing or renewing, we should see these as sets of practices or categories of practices. And the practices themselves are more specific. They're not so much just about intention, but they must have the specificity of something about the bodies involved, the materiality involved, and a recognition of the additional or unintended consequences, both desirable, so some practices will build relationships, friendships, and the undesirable, the snowballing or the escalating knock-on effects of a particular practice, sometimes quite undesired. So to focus on the teleeffectiveness of a practice, we are communicating here or we're coordinating here, is to downplay the unintended consequences. And it's therefore we should avoid naming practices in terms of their functions, the ings of reinventing, of renewing, and we should allow for a range of practice consequences and give these practices material and bodily specificity rather than relying too much on describing them in terms of their teleoeffectiveness, their purposes, functions, and desires. So I feel there's a slight danger. Let's think of these ing words as describing sets of practices, not particular practices, and avoid naming a particular practice in terms of its function. Okay? You
Thank
want me to move on?
I mean, thank you for sharing your learnings. It's so inspiring to see how you yourself like critique or challenge your own thoughts from 20, 30 years ago, and you think about it and renew them and also publish them and share them with us, because it's very inspiring to hear how it evolved over time and also how you see it now and how we can think about it. Can you just
It's worse, Renata. Anna, the paper I did with Anna is just last year. I'm
That's true.
somewhat critiquing that work. It's only somewhat, as to an extent, just to
But that's
exemplify.
great. I mean, research is it's a discussion, it's an ongoing conversation. So
Yes.
you already can have a conversation with your own or with your co-authors, and we can all participate in it.
Yeah.
So, from all these learnings, what do you think are opportunities that you would like to share with us?
Three things. I'm just going to be fairly quick on these, and I'm coming to an end. Um, we've been a centripetal movement, i.e., outside the United States, but we haven't taken full advantage of the large communities, for instance, in Latin America, in Africa, and Asia, that offer us very different institutional contexts. So consider China, for instance. There's a very different philosophical tradition. There's a very different kind of state there, and they haven't had business schools or Western consulting firms for very long. So, what then are strategy practices outside the institutional context of North America, Australasia, and perhaps Europe? How are the practices different? I'm going to reference a nice Bourdieusian study by Pratap and Saha in Strategic Management Journal that looked at the evolution of strategy practices in a large Indian steel company. That's a great model, and we should do more of that work. At the moment, this is I think it's called a cartogram, a map of the world, you see, which reflects the overwhelming predominance of Western European SAP work. SAP does not represent Europe does not represent 45% of the land mass of the world. Perhaps about 10%. But it seems to occupy at least 45% of the mass of SAP research. We need to balance that. More work from the United States, but more work also perhaps from Africa, India, China, and other places in Asia and Southern American states. That would be great. More, and I think this would also lend it to us to comparative studies. It would be very interesting to study um, the same practice in very different institutional contexts around the world, but also the Zurich team has been very good at doing comparisons of inter-organizational strategizing and intra-organizational strategizing. So Violetta Splitter, David Seidel, and I did a piece in SMJ last year where we compared the strategizing efforts of various groups within the same organization. There's lots of scope within a single case study to do more internal, intra-organizational comparison. Well, there we are looking at the way in which groups were participating in an open strategy initiative. Some were more successful than others. There's a lot to learn from the comparisons. Finally, and then SOD, and it goes back to how the Strategic Management Society originally saw us as practically relevant. Well, actually, we're not that relevant, or we haven't perhaps invested as much as we could in more practical relevance. And I'm going to single out Christian Stadler, Julia Hautz and colleagues' work on open strategy, where their book recently has been very well publicized and promoted on social media. They published in Slow Management Review, Harvard Business Review, and California Management Review as well. And they've got themselves onto Thinkers 50 list. So this is really impressive. We need to convert some of our research into more practical relevance. I think there's a big opportunity there. Christian Stadler, Julia House and colleagues offer a great model. Okay, so 3 sets of opportunities.
I wanted to say thank you for sharing this. And also, I know that you're a driving force behind including scholars from all over the world into the strategy as practice. What I've learned recently was that actually there is quite a lot of research done in Africa and South America and India and some other countries. And we actually have an initiative now led by the SMS Strategy Practice Interest Group that I want to advertise here now. It's led by Anne-Marie Davis from South Africa, and they're actually constructing a database with all the SAP research that has been done so we can across continents learn from each other and also see how they write about it and how they use it.
That's fabulous. And there's one other thing too that SMS has is one of its 2 strategic priorities is increasing the presence of underrepresented regions. And I think it's not just a matter of inclusion or even introducing new empirical contexts, but I believe there might be, especially perhaps in indigenous thinking and maybe in Chinese or Indian thought, those traditions, new concepts as well, new ways of seeing the world, not just new concepts, contexts. I've got a last slide. Can I show it to you?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, recently, Paula, David, and Julia did a piece in Human Relations, which proposed a kind of life cycle model of strategy as practice. They saw the future as propagation into new fields. That's wonderful. But I'm going to push a little bit against what a slight implication I don't think was intentional. And that was the life cycle where we're in a phase of maturity. No, we're not. We are perpetually immature. We are auto-regenerating. We have flowers all over the place. Thank you. I wish I could do that. Now, we are always going to have new practices emerging for strategy as practice scholars to understand. AI-assisted strategizing, open strategy has been around for a lot. Virtual strategizing using, Zoom technologies and similar. Those are new opportunities, new practices to study. These are practices are happening in new organizational forms. I mentioned digital autonomous organizations and holacracies. There are others. So we have new contexts. We have new problems, such as the grand societal challenges, and more. The world will keep spinning out, keep giving us new challenges to look at. And we have new methodological resources, Robin Engelbach at University of Zurich and presently at Oxford is using Zoom meetings of strategists at work, which allows an absolutely micro ability to study and follow the strategizing activity in micro detail, seeing the faces, seeing the mice moving across shared boards, discussion boards, and also just being able to automatically transcribe the script as well. And of course, we have other methodological resources in artificial intelligence, large language models to follow changing discourses. So I would argue that SAP is a perennial flower, not an annual. It's not following a life cycle. It will self-seed and regenerate. So my final flower, my final picture is this. SAP is a hardy perennial, self-regenerating, self-seeding with a blooming future. Thank you, Renata.
Thank you, Richard, for sharing the journey of SAP with us. Thank you for taking the time. And thanks to the audience for watching and listening. And please reach out with any questions you might have.